that time of year for graduations. And of course, those are significant milestones. They signify the completion of a course of study. Tests were passed, maybe barely, but well enough. Assignments were completed more or less. I mean, what more could you need to know, right? I mean, we sort of think that once you receive that diploma or degree, that you move on, and life is just entirely different. But from my experience, graduations I've been through, the difference is never as big as I expected it to be. Now, I suspect that as the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea, I think perhaps they thought about it like a graduation. You know, their time of slavery in Egypt was completed, and they had learned a lot about God, and in the process, it was like a master class on his power and glory. They witnessed the 10 plagues, and then crossing through the Red Sea. And you might think, well, what more could you need to know after that? I mean, they were embarking on a new life. But that didn't mean that their spiritual education was over. Really, it was just the beginning. And so in the weeks after they crossed the Red Sea, the people of Israel experienced a series of tests in the wilderness. Now, over the course of my education, I think I've probably taken 3 types of tests. One is an assessment of your knowledge, abilities, qualifications. And when you take one of those, normally the person administering it is impartial. I mean, they don't really care how you do on it. They're just there to make sure it's fair and there's no cheating, right? But then there's times I've encountered a few teachers who maybe have a little bit of a hostile streak, you know, and they sort of want to put students in their place. And I had this one professor who would ask questions based upon the footnotes in the reading. So that sort of thing, you know, to sort of just catch you. But then there's a third type of test where the teacher tells you what to expect and thoroughly prepares you beforehand, where it's really not so much about the grade, but about helping you learn what you need to know and really understand it. And you know, that's the kind of test that God gives. It's that third type. He doesn't test us to see whether we're worthy or qualified, because he already knows that we're not, right? We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. He doesn't use tests to punish us, to try to trip us up, put us in our place. No. When the Lord brings tests, he wants us to learn and grow. He wants us to be transformed. And that's what we see in Exodus 15, verse 22, down through chapter 17, verse 7, kind of a longer passage this morning, but the people of Israel undergo 4 tests from the Lord that teach vital lessons about living by faith. Now, of course, we've called this series Humble Leadership, and Moses finds himself caught in the middle of each of those tests. The people are quick to blame him for their troubles. I mean, even though he's there facing the same problems that they are. And so how does he respond? Well, we'll see that he doesn't ignore their complaints, but he doesn't try to sort of intimidate them into silence, into silent submission. That's not what he does. He humbly leads them to trust the Lord. So he's a great example that way. And so we'll see in each test that there's a problem, there's a protest, a prayer, and then a promise from God and a procedure to follow. The first test that the people of Israel face is to trust God to heal. The discovery of bacteria dates all the way back to 1676, and since that time, the whole germ theory of disease has shaped modern medicine as we know it. And so when we're sick, we sort of expect that medical professionals would just have all the answers. Right? And some people would insist that faith really has no part in dealing with health. But then we have circumstances come along that expose the limits of scientific medical knowledge, right? And it's a humbling thing. And so how should believers respond? Well, the people of Israel encounter this test just a few days after crossing the Red Sea. And so if we look at Exodus 15, verse 22, it picks up right after the song of Moses. And it says, "Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water." It says when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Now, as we've seen throughout Exodus, these ancient locations are very hard to pinpoint with any accuracy today. But if Mount Sinai was in the south of the Sinai Peninsula, as is traditionally thought, then the people were probably making their way down along the eastern shore of the Gulf of Suez, that arm of the Red Sea that reaches up into Egypt. And so there's this wide, sandy strip of land that runs along the coast and skirts the mountains lying further inland. And so the people are traveling that way, and they desperately need water. But their problem is that this pool that they come to is bitter. Now, it's probably not, doesn't mean that it just tasted bad, but that it was polluted, right, with something that would make them sick, because we'll see as the text goes on, it's really focusing on healing. And yet, we see here another type of bitterness. Another type of sickness becomes evident as the people respond and they protest. It uses that word grumbling there. And it's interesting because in other contexts, that word refers to stopping somewhere for the night, staying somewhere, dwelling somewhere. In a way, that's what happens when we complain, right? We take an issue, we take a problem, and we camp on it. We obsess over it, right? And worry begins to consume our thoughts, and then this bitterness wells up in our hearts and spews out through our words. And that's what's happening here. Now, we're not told all that the people of Israel said on this occasion, but what's clear is that they direct their grumbling straight at Moses, right? And so how does he respond? Well, we'll see here he prays, and the Lord answers with a procedure and a promise, like we talked about. So verses 25 and 26 tell us he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do that which is right in his eyes and give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." So what's the deal with this log? Right? Why does Moses throw it into the water? God's the creator, right? He could just cause this water to be healed, to be fixed, to be cleansed. So was the log symbolic, or did it really have some kind of natural antiseptic or antibacterial properties? We're not told. But what's clear is that God wants the people to place their trust in his healing power. Right? And so he makes this connection. Just as he brought the plagues upon the Egyptians, he can bring healing to the people of Israel, the opposite. And yet he still gives Moses this step, this practical action of throwing the log in the water. And so I think you see that the physical and the spiritual are inseparable here. And so there's this balance that we still have to maintain in life, because we seldom know where the physical stops and the spiritual starts. We don't always know how to separate the two. Now, in this case, the Lord's promise of not putting upon them these diseases is contingent upon their obedience. Right? He hasn't revealed all of his commandments yet, but with this test, he's preparing them for that, to listen and to do what's right. But that raises some questions then. Does the conditional nature of the promise here suggest that sickness is a punishment from God? Is healing guaranteed if you obey? And I think we have to say no. I mean, this promise relates specifically to the people of Israel and specifically to the judgments that they just witnessed in Egypt, right? What the Lord is saying is that he won't bring those plagues upon them the way he did in Egypt as a judgment. Now, at the same time, the Lord identifies himself. He says, I am the Lord your healer. It's part of his character. It's who he is. In his goodness, he desires for all creation to enjoy healing and wholeness. Disease only exists as a consequence of Adam and Eve's sin, right? The fall. But part of the gospel is that the Lord, our healer, will ultimately eliminate sickness and death. And Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 15. He sees it as the ultimate outcome of Christ's resurrection. He's gained victory over death. One day, death will be finished. And so when we encounter sickness, we shouldn't think of it as a punishment for some sin that we've committed, but it is always a test to trust God to heal. We can take advantage of physical medical treatments. We should, but we should also pray for healing on the basis of God's nature as the Lord our healer. Now, if I don't experience healing here and now, then that part of his character, that good news of ultimate healing, gives me hope that one day I will be healed, that it'll come at my resurrection and glorification with Christ. And yet, the Lord might choose to heal, right? He might lead me to a place of health and wholeness. And even here, after this time of testing, he brings the people of Israel to a place like that. Exodus 15:27, just briefly, tells us this. It says, then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Right? So, trust God to heal. And then the next test, secondly, is that the people of Israel are supposed to trust God to provide. Now, our supermarkets are the picture of abundance, right? I mean, the aisles are just lined with a ridiculous variety of choices for every item. And it seems inexhaustible. But, I mean, we've seen, even over the past year, that the system is more fragile than we realize when producers shut down at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic in 2020. I mean, stores began to experience shortages of a lot of goods. And so all it would take is the combination of a few different tragic events to wipe stores out in a matter of days. So whether we realize it or not, we're constantly tested with trusting God to provide. Even though we live in a society that seems to have so much, it could all be taken away in the blink of an eye. Now, of course, the people of Israel didn't have access to a supermarket in the wilderness, right? And remember back in Exodus 12, we read that there were 600,000 Hebrew men plus women and children, and then this mixed multitude of other people who left Egypt with them. I mean, they would have wiped out a supermarket in the blink of an eye, right? So how could they possibly feed so many mouths? I mean, that was a serious problem. So I think they probably spent at least a week or more resting at Elim, and so the narrative resumes about a month into their journey. Whatever provisions they had taken with them from Egypt are completely depleted now. And so chapter 16, verses 1 through 3 tells us this. They set out from Elim, and the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And then it says the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Now, the name Wilderness of Sin has nothing to do with our English word sin. It's a Hebrew word. And scholars think it may mean something like clay, that it was a sort of like a dry clay valley. But there's no question here that the people's response is sinful, right? I mean, they start grumbling again, camping on their complaints, their hunger. And so as we saw at the crossing of the Red Sea, when they do that, whenever we panic, it distorts our perspective. And so they start talking about their slavery in Egypt like it was a time of plenty, about how much meat they had. And so they're accusing Moses and Aaron of seeking to kill them. It's just ridiculous. And yet the Lord responds with such grace. He gives them this miraculous promise. And again, a procedure, something practical that they have to do. The text makes it seem as if Moses hadn't even had a chance to pray about it. But verses 4 through 5 tell us, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not.' And then it says, 'On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily.'" So how is this miraculous provision of bread from heaven a test? Well, I mean, you think about it, the Lord could just eliminate their hunger and sustain them miraculously without food. But that's not what he does here, right? Instead, he gives them just enough bread each day, right? A daily portion. He doesn't give them any surplus on days, at least on days 1 through 5. He does on day 6, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But the point is that they have to trust him each day. They have to wake up and believe that it's going to be there, that the Lord's going to come through. So as they announce this plan, Moses and Aaron decide to deal with the people's grumbling, right? Because this test isn't just a matter of being physically hungry, right? It's a test of faith. The people need to believe in the Lord. They need to live for his glory. And so verses 6 through 12 tell us, "So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, 'At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us?' And Moses said, 'When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord.' Then Moses said to Aaron, 'Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.' And it tells us, as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God.'" Now, some leaders might be tempted to say that any complaint against their leadership is against the Lord, right? But that's not true. Leaders are fallible and sinful, and so we need to accept criticism and hear people out. But they also have to lead people to see the heart of the issue. Right now, the knee-jerk reaction sometimes in leaders is to approach every conflict as a lack of submission. But there's more to it than that. And here, what we see with Moses and Aaron is that they managed to very skillfully to step out of the way and to bring the people directly before the Lord. And that's what every humble leader needs to strive to do. And so though the people don't deserve it, the Lord goes beyond the provision of bread by giving them this meat in the evening. Verses 13 through 15 tell us a little more about that. It says, "In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. And it says, when the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." Right, so quail typically spend their time on the ground. They're not that big, around 3 to 5 pounds, and they're only able to fly in short bursts. And so you could imagine this scene as thousands, even millions of these little birds descend upon this camp, right? And so it doesn't seem like that part of this was an ongoing thing, right? The Lord promises to give them bread daily, but I think the meat here was more of a one-time occasion. It happens again in Numbers, but some have tried to come up with a natural explanation for the bread, right? Perhaps you could do that for the quail, but for the bread it's a little hard because it's consistently available day after day. Right? Psalm 78:25 calls it the bread of the angels. So in verses 16 through 21, Moses explains more about the bread and the procedure for gathering it. Right now, again, this miracle is a test. Right? And so it's a practical way for the Lord to train them to trust and obey. Moses says, this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And it tells us the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less, but when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And it tells us, verses 19 through 20, Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till the morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. So verse 21 says, "Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat, but when the sun grew hot, it melted." So an omer, scholars think, was probably around a quart. Right? And this whole procedure of gathering the bread each day trained the people to avoid two different temptations. I mean, on one hand, fear could drive them to try to gather more, to hoard it up, right? But God had a solution for that. It would spoil if they did that, right? It would breed worms, it would stink. And so they needed to trust God to provide each day. Right? Now, on the other hand, presumption and arrogance could lead them to be lazy, and just assume that it's going to be there. So God designed the flakes to melt away as the sun grew hot. Right? They couldn't sleep in. To enjoy God's provision, they had to get up and get to work. So, we come to the New Testament, and Jesus calls all of us who follow him to that same sort of dependence. Right? There's this balance as we trust in the Lord. He teaches us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." He says that we don't have to be anxious about what we'll eat or what we drink. But then, on the other hand, we're also commanded in the New Testament, in Colossians, to do our work heartily for the Lord. Right? To take care of ourselves. So aren't we learning to trust God to provide, even when it seems like we have an abundance? Right? To know that each and every day, I only have food today because it's from the Lord. The third test Israel faces in the wilderness is to trust God to rest. Of course, Genesis 1 and 2 tell us that God completed his work of creation in 6 days and then rested on the seventh. And by blessing the seventh day and making it holy, he established a rhythm of 6 days of work and one of rest. And there's this wisdom in that, because if we stay busy with endless activity, if we're always working, it's really easy to just push aside any thoughts of God. We become entirely self-dependent when we live that way. But when you stop, when you breathe, when you Look around at the majesty of creation. It points you back to your Creator. That was the whole idea of the Sabbath. So as we've seen, the Lord incorporated this pattern into his provision of bread for the people in the wilderness, right? He promised to provide twice the amount of bread on the sixth day. And we'll see that this time he keeps that bread from spoiling as it did the rest of the week. But here again, part of this plan is another test. Because to enjoy this day of rest, the people also had to prepare. They had to get ready for it. And so Moses reviews the procedure with them in Exodus 16, verses 22 through 26. It says, on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning. And it says, so they laid it aside till morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath for the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. Now it's interesting. Thus far, the book of Exodus is focused almost entirely on the leadership of Moses. But there in verse 22, you have this mention of other leaders in the congregation. And they report to Moses that the people are gathering this extra bread. His response to me suggests that maybe they were concerned that the people were doing something wrong. Maybe they were breaking the rules. I mean, I kind of wonder if they were already starting to succumb to that legalistic, judgmental sort of impulse that we see later on in the Pharisees at the time of Christ. I mean, if so, that's the opposite of humble leadership. And so Moses explains that the people are following God's instructions to prepare for the Sabbath. Now, the real concern becomes apparent the next day, when it becomes clear that some people have ignored the Lord's instructions. They didn't prepare for the Sabbath. And so verses 27 through 30 tell us, on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord is giving you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remaining should be in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. It says, so the people rested on the seventh day. So this time, it's the Lord who protests, not the people. Right? But it sounds as if he's confronting Moses as an individual. But he's not. The word you there in verse 28 is plural. It's sort of like y'all, It refers to the nation as a whole. So we're not told exactly why these people go out and gather, whether it was negligence on their part or intentional rebellion, or maybe they hoped to gain extra bread or something. There may have been a variety of reasons, but what's clear is you see this problem that Israel is going to have time and again as they receive commands from the Lord, that they never fully obey so as to enjoy the full promise of God's rest. Now we come to the New Testament, and Jesus presents himself as the true source of rest. Right? Matthew 11, 28 through 30 tells us that he said, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. See, when we're yoked with Christ, he carries the burden of obedience. As we read in the New Testament epistles like Romans, he fulfills the righteous requirement of the law for us. He opens the way for us to enter into that eternal rest in the presence of God. And as we journey toward that destination, he keeps us on track and trains us to grow in obedience. Right? So even for us, to prepare for that time of rest, we have to receive him, to believe, and to take up his yoke. Now, the Lord wanted the people of Israel to learn the lessons from these tests and then to pass them on to future generations. And so verses 31 through 36 back in Exodus 16 tell us, now the house of Israel called its name, the bread, manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded, let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And then it says, Moses said to Aaron, take a jar, put an omer of manna in it, and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. And it tells us the people of Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And omer is the 10th part of an ephah. So the events of this paragraph may have occurred much later. I mean, it sounds as if the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant had already been built to show God's presence with them and their commitment to them. And that was what they were supposed to do, is to keep the manna in along with the ark. But the people, even here it's clear that the people weren't going to grasp that God would provide for them, that God would give them rest. Right? Because they were supposed to go up into the promised land. Right? The only reason they had to eat manna for 40 years was because they refused to trust in God's promises. And so it was a punishment that God sentenced them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Right? That jar of manna was supposed to be this teaching tool to help them to trust, to remember how God provided. It's the same sort of thing we need to do, to look back and remember all that God does to take care of us. So there's one more test here, moving into chapter 17 of Exodus. And it's to trust God to test. I mean, in a way, we like to think of life as sort of this giant seesaw. If I go down for a while, then I expect that I should get to come back up. Right? Someone else should have to spend their time down. And we even kind of apply that way of thinking to God, where it's like if God tests us enough, then we get to the point where you think, well, I should have the right to question him. He should have to answer me. But it doesn't work that way. The Lord is always the exalted one. Right? I should always be the one to bow before him and to humbly accept the tests that he brings. So here in our story, the Lord leads the people of Israel into another test. And this time, they try to twist it around, to turn it against the Lord. Exodus 17, verses 1 through 3 tells us, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And Moses said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? It says, but the people thirsted there for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So you think, after all the miraculous things they've seen by this point, I mean, you would think that they would trust God, that they would just pray and believe that he would take care of them. But it's like here, their panic this time is even greater. And they're not just grumbling, they're angry, they're quarrelsome. And so Moses tries to show them the implications of what they're doing in this response, that they're trying to put the Lord to the test. But they're really not receptive to that, right? They're not listening to him. And so Moses looks to the Lord in prayer, and And the Lord gives another promise and another procedure to follow. Verses 4 through 6 tell us, so Moses cried to the Lord, what shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So the Lord responds to the people's ingratitude and animosity with amazing grace here. He doesn't rebuke them, doesn't punish them. He works through Moses and just quenches their thirst by miraculously providing abundant water for them. But the presence of the elders here gives the event a sense of formality. It's like the evidence of God's faithfulness is being presented so that the events of the day will be remembered. And they are remembered. Verse 7 puts it this way. It says, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? Other scripture passages written later look back to this event as this decisive moment. Psalm 95, for instance, verses 6 through 9, captures the lesson of it all by saying, "O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work." So it's a challenge to us. Will we bow before the Lord as we encounter hard times? Will we trust him through those times of testing? Will we remember all the ways that he's carried us in the past? Or will we panic, right, when we encounter hardship? Will we grumble and quarrel? Will we demand proof of God's existence and his goodness? We have to trust the Lord through those times of testing. So even though we don't experience the miracles that the people of Israel experienced there, we do face the same tests. Right? Will we trust God to heal? Will we trust him to provide, to give rest, and to lead us through those times of testing? Do we start grumbling, complaining? Do we become bitter? Or do we pray and walk by faith and follow the procedures, the steps that the Lord gives us in humble obedience? Maybe you've never thought of life that way. I mean, that God exists and that he works through the circumstances of our lives to teach us. It's not just random. It's not just chance. So if you've never done so, I'd encourage you to start trusting the Lord. The scripture promises that if we draw near to him, he will draw near to us. If you want to learn more about how he works through trials, the first chapter of the little book of James in the New Testament would be a great place to read. Maybe you're in the midst of a time of testing. Is there a lesson you need to learn? Are you staying humble? Are you staying teachable? Don't harden your heart. Seek the Lord. Maybe you have a friend who's struggling. Would you pray for that person? Try to encourage them. Not to give them all the answers. We don't have all the answers. Right? But to come alongside, to walk with them, to support them. May we walk by faith in the Lord.